Welcome to panel 6. Our first speaker is Dr. Grace Khuri. Grace has just finished her doctorate in studies of J.R.R. Tolkien and his different iterations of the Silmarillion. And she's Oxford's very first doctoral recipient who studied J.R.R. Tolkien. And today she'll be talking about the influence of Norse myth and sagas on the writings of E.R. Eddison. So you'll give Grace your attention.
All right, thank you everyone for coming to this talk. I hope you enjoy it. Eric Rooker Eddison was born in Adel, Yorkshire, to solicitor Octavius Eddison and his wife Helen Louisa Rooker. As a fantasy author a decade older than his more widely read contemporaries, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, whose Inklings meetings he once graced in the early 1940s, his writings were published early enough to influence the more famous duo of Oxford Dons. By the time Tolkien published The Hobbit in 1937, Eddison had already put out 2 of his novels. As with Tolkien and Lewis, Old Norse literature, the myths and heroic, often fantastic sagas of medieval Iceland, influenced Eddison's fiction. Eddison began teaching himself Old Icelandic at Eton in the 1890s, as did Tolkien while at Birmingham's King Edward School almost 2 decades later. Eddison continued learning Norse after he went up to Trinity College, Oxford, to study classics, in which he achieved a second-class degree in 1905. Tolkien also studied classics for the first 2 years of his degree before switching to the English school, as part of which he studied Scandinavian philology. However, unlike Tolkien and Lewis, Eddison's career would not be in academia but in the civil service. In 1906, he joined the Board of Trade, and in the same year he became a member of the Viking Club, later renamed, as it remains today, the Viking Society of Northern Research. While too old for military service in World War II, Eddison, like Tolkien, served as an air raid warden. However, he was not untouched by that conflict's tragedy, as his son-in-law was a casualty. Eddison is most remembered for his heroic fantasy, starting with The Worm of Ouroboros, followed by the related Simiambian trilogy, The Mistress of Mistresses, Fichtner and Memeson, and the posthumously published and incomplete The Mezentian Gate. Although Eddison's oeuvre represents a pastiche of classical, medieval, and Elizabethan influences, and more generally are markedly intertextual works, this talk will consider his amateur Old Norse scholarship, which leaves its traces on his epic fantasy novels. Old Norse myths and sagas were enormously popular in the Victorian and Edwardian periods and widely accessible through translations and adaptations in children's readers. Viking-themed novels, which more or less closely emulated the medieval sagas, were all the rage, a noted example being H. Rider Haggard's Eric Brighteyes. In one of his letters, Eddison recalls how he first took up Icelandic at 17 in what he describes as a saga madness. During the 2-year period of 1900 and 1901, Eddison acquired a slew of translations, including George Webb Dasent's The Story of Burnt Njal from Brennu Njal's saga, and also a 1900 reprint of William Morris's and Eirikr Magnusson's The Saga of Grettir the Strong, or Gretti's saga, about the doomed anti-hero Grettir, who fights trolls and the undead. He also owned many editions in the Norse original and language textbooks like Henry Sweet's Icelandic Primer and Vigfússon and York Powell's Icelandic Prose Reader. A few years after The Worm of Ouroboros, Eddison published Styrbjorn the Strong, expanding on a figure from Erbia saga, which he read in William Morris's translation. Although not a professional academic, in 1930, his translation of Egil's saga, only the second rendering of that work into English, was published with Cambridge University Press. It opens with a historical and literary introduction and ends with a terminal essay on translation. It is presented in relatively archaic English, with at least one more faithful rendering from the Old Norse, using the term bonders, from the Old Norse plural bunder, for farmers. Eddison corresponded with and received advice from several notable Norse scholars, like Bertha Philpotts, mistress of Girton College, Cambridge. In his book, Vikings and Victorians, Andrew Wan calls Eddison a serious and imaginative Icelandicist. All this material provided an imaginative wellspring which became evident to other readers reading Eddison's fiction. In 1922, H. Rider Haggard wrote Eddison praising his work and recognizing the saga influence in The Worm of Ouroboros. C.S. Lewis wrote to Eddison in 1942, using Elizabethan spelling and the Middle English word auctor in his witty typescript letter, in which he recognized in Eddison's writing, "The auctors in whom I perceive you to be very well versed, as William of Kelmscott, Snorri, Homer, and Thomas Brown Knight." Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century Icelandic chieftain, politician, and mythographer, compiled one of the two remaining sources of Norse mythology, the Prose Edda, while William of Kelmscott refers to William Morris, whose home was named Kelmscott Manor. Morris was a predecessor and literary inspiration who, like Eddison, was also an amateur Norse scholar who translated sagas and wrote fantastic romances with northern elements. While not the predominant feature in Eddison's fiction, Norse elements in his novels can range from decorative to more thematically significant instances. The Worm of Ouroboros is the most commonly read of Eddison's four fantasy novels. It starts in our world in the early 20th century. In an article on Eddison's translation of Egil's saga, Professor Matthew Townend compares the novel's beginning to those of Norse sagas, following the Maður heit X, man called X formula, examples of which are found in Eddison's two saga translations. And so you see examples of that here. There was a man named Thorstein, man named Ulf, man named Lessingham. Lessingham's house has a special room in which he is met by a magical vehicle that travels through time and space and takes him to a fanciful rendering of Mercury, where he witnesses an ongoing war between the two super races, the warring demon lords of Lord Jus, Brandok Taha, and Goldry Blusco, against the witch lords of Carsi, led by their sorcerer king Goris XII and their allies. Eddison's nomenclature, criticized by Tolkien as slipshod, is curiously childish, featuring realms like Pixie Land, Impland, and Goblin Land. The beings described can look more or less as what their names suggest. The demons have horns but are otherwise human in appearance. The pixies of this world are not diminutive, and the pixie lord La Farise seems like a figure from French medieval romance. The wider world depicted is like reading a Thomas Malory reimagining of Mercury, with a language and culture evocative of the Arthurian court dramas of England and France. Words like plaisances used in chapter 8, or a reference to jousting in chapter 9, and aristocratic women like the Lady Mevrian and later Lady Presmyra all point to the strong influence of medieval chivalric literature. Yet the demon lords possess dragons of war, ships with dragon heads at the prow, as told in chapter 8. References made to fetches of the dead, a type of spirit from the Norse sagas, which in the novel are remarked to be streaming up from Erebus, the underworld of Greek myth, shows Eddison's interweaving of Norse and classical influences. This story pits the demon lords against the witch lords, whose sorcerer king Goris XII perhaps influenced Tolkien's Witch King, the Lord of the Nazgul in The Lord of the Rings. King Goris summons the terrible Worm of Ouroboros from the abyss to best his enemies, a monster more generally symbolic of the cyclical nature of warfare, as at the end of the novel, when the demons have defeated the lords of Witchland, they cannot abide to live without conflict, and are granted by the gods to reset time so they can fight their old foes all over again. Such a shocking conclusion is particularly striking in a work developed in the aftermath of the First World War, a conflict in which Eddison was not a combatant, unlike his contemporaries Lewis and Tolkien. And yet it was oddly prescient about the future in the aftermath of what was later disproved concept of a war to end all wars. Some character names in the novel are of Norse derivation. King Erp of Elion, one of the allies of the witches, is from the Norse Erpr, the half-brother of the heroes Hamdir and Sorli in Hamvismal from the Poetic Edda. The goblin Lord Gro, the duplicitous villain and counselor to King Gorys, is also Norse in origin, a variant of Groa meaning to grow, the name of a sorceress in Snorri's Prose Edda. Lord Gro assists the Sorcerer King in summoning the Worm of Ouroboros, and more generally, in keeping with the sense of his name, can be said to grow mischief to one side or the other, and he changes sides a couple of times. In a 1957 letter, Tolkien saw the Worm of Ouroboros as being corrupted by an evil and indeed silly philosophy, and was concerned that Eddison was coming to admire more and more arrogance and cruelty. Yet Tolkien praises Eddison's work for its sheer literary merit. While objecting to the characters, he makes an exception for Lord Gro. Tolkien may have been intrigued by the particularly fitting use of the Norse name in the context of the novel. An exception to the slipshod nomenclature he protested, as well as that figure's moral complexity of having treachery mixed with some conscience. And just to conclude, we're going to fittingly end with the Norse apocalypse as referenced in the end of one of his novels. It is perhaps fitting to conclude with his borrowing of Ragnarok, the Doom of the Gods, the penultimate chapter of Edison's second novel, The Mistress of Mistresses, bears the title Enfreki Rana, or as he puts it, The Wolf Runs, borrowing the refrain from Völuspá in the Poetic Edda, referring to the lupine son of the trickster god Loki. In Snorri's Prose Edda, it is told how Fenrir is bound by the gods in a vain attempt to prevent their destruction and the wolf's role in it, which includes the slaying of Odin, the leader of the gods. Fenrir only agrees to be bound if the god Tyr, shown here, agrees to put his hand in the wolf's mouth as a pledge, so that if Fenrir is unable to loose himself from the final magical bond put on him by the gods or the Aesir, under the feint of testing his strength, he will bite off Tyr's hand, which is what happens. The refrain Enfreki Rana is in the latter portion of the Völuspá, tells of the terrifying liberation of Fenrir and the end of most of the Norse gods. Edison uses this for the ending of his novel of court intrigues in Zemianvia, a nearby realm to the realm of the demons. Part of a wider cultural draw to the Norse apocalypse in the early and mid-20th century, which is something that I've looked at in my thesis as a historical trend. Like others, Edison used more or less apparent borrowings from Norse myth and sagas to help develop his invented worlds, but did so in a way that synthesized a variety of influences. So I just wanted to end by showing you a lovely hand-drawn genealogy from the Bodleian, where he, this is from an unpublished saga that's in the Bodleian, and he made a hand-drawn tree. And yes, a family tree. Thank you all for listening. Question?
Something in the chat.
We have time for a question? Anybody? Carry the microphone about. All right. We'll move on to our next speaker then. You've all met Stuart already, but just as a reminder, Stuart's a leading scholar of fantasy literature and an academic here at Oxford, and he'll be speaking to us next on, sorry, I've already blanked, on J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah. You've heard of him.
Yes, yeah. Right.
So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you all for coming, and everyone who's online again, just to repeat our thanks to you. This is proving a fantastic event. And so the title of my talk, or the task I've been set, is to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien. And you remember yesterday, or some of you who were here, I proposed a framework of how to look at or discuss a fantasy writer, a fantasy text, and so on. So I'm going to mark my own homework and try and work through the Discworld framework with J.R.R. Tolkien. And I guess it is appropriate that we're kind of halfway through this summer school, and here's Tolkien, because the conversations often go everything that happened before Tolkien and everything that happens after Tolkien. So he's that pivotal point. And keeping with Terry Pratchett, just because so many people came up to me and said, I'm so glad to hear Terry Pratchett mentioned, I'll give you a quote from Terry Pratchett. J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close, sometimes it's a shape on the horizon, sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either has made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. And whatever you think of Tolkien, good or bad, we cannot escape him, so therefore it is appropriate that we try to go through him as a writer. I'm just going to start with the things that you probably need to know so that we're all on the same level. So the key texts that you need to sort of familiarise yourself with, and you probably already have, are The Hobbit, 1937. I'll come back to why 1951 is in brackets. The Lord of the Rings, 1954 to 55. The Silmarillion, published posthumously in 1977, edited by his son. The other two key texts I would say you should get into your library of Tolkien studies in terms of his writing are his letters, which was revised and came out in 2023, and his poetry, which came out for the first time last year in 2024 in terms of the full collected edition. But we should also rejoice, perhaps, in the fact that there are many other texts appearing under his name. The History of Middle-earth series, 12 volumes, plus The Nature of Middle-earth, which came out in 1996. I should have put Unfinished Tales in here, sorry. An extraordinary study by his son Christopher into the composition of the various texts that we've just referred to outside of The Hobbit. There are the Great Tales which have appeared, the 4 Great Tales which are referenced and came out in their own separate edition. There are the Minor Tales, Roverandom, Farmer Giles of Ham, Smith of Wootton Major, etc., etc. And then there are the other texts, which I will come on to in a second, his academic writing. And there are a lot of secondary reading texts. We are not short of academic studies of Tolkien. And there are a few there, and there are many more. I would just really like to highlight the work done by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull, which is the top one there, the J.R.R. Tolkien Companion and Guide. I'm not familiar with a text like this for other writers, in that it not only gives you a detailed analysis of all the themes in Tolkien, but in the chronology, more or less a month-by-month account of what he was doing. To absolute precise details. So extraordinary material out there if you wish to carry on. Okay, so the standard he was born in. Here's the life of J.R.R. Tolkien, born in 1892 and dies in 1973. So he lives to a ripe old age, and he's born in South Africa, but he's English through and through. He moves back when he's very young. King Edward School, Birmingham. And then with a couple of minor sort of diversions, he's an Oxford person through and through. Studies at Exeter, as we've already heard, classics then English, and then comes back here to become professor at Pembroke and then Merton. And we have in the dates there of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. So there are two things I just want to point out about this. First of all, as you'll see in 1915, not a good time to be a young person. He enlists in the Lancashire Fusiliers. 1916, he fights on the Battle of the Somme, and many people have talked about the influences of that. But the second thing, and most notably, is his job is as an academic. He was not paid to be a writer of fantasy fiction. He was paid to lecture, teach, and supervise researchers here, and that point will come up again. Okay, so was Tolkien writing fantasy? I gave a talk on Friday to the prospective students at Oxford, and I said, was Tolkien writing fantasy? And I said, yes, he was. Now, that's about it. And none of them got the joke. So they all sat there looking bewildered, but I said, okay, well, let's explore it a bit more. But clearly he was. So if we take what I was saying yesterday about the definition, the impossibility test, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion all pass the impossibility test. It just doesn't happen and couldn't happen. And we could also say the same for some of his minor tales. Some of them do sort of start blurring the boundaries between his work, isolated work, but also his mythology. But they're also definitely texts of a fantasy nature. But I wanted to just pick up a couple of extracts here, which we suddenly got sight of last year. So on the left is the start of a poem called Tol Eressëa, which really is embedded in his mythology. Tol Eressëa is a mystical island where the elves live in his mythology, and you can see he's writing that in early 1916. He reworks that poem only a few months later, and this time he dedicates it for England, the Lonely Isle, in June 1916. So it's a fantasy poem, or a poem about his mythology, it certainly is. But then he repurposes it as he is sent out to the Western Front, and it becomes a memory, a eulogy to what he's leaving behind, notably England and Edith, his wife. So he was writing fantasy. Well, was he? Well, he certainly wasn't paid to write fantasy, as I've already made the point, and this is something which you will occasionally hear in the English faculty, or certainly did, about Tolkien. This is a list of his academic publications. Seem to be missing one there, the Anchor Wissa, which is kind of major. I think the key thing you'd say from this, two things. One is his scholarship was very, very good. We still cite a lot and read a lot of his works. The second thing you'd say is there's not a lot there. He did not publish extensively, and one of the criticisms of Tolkien is that he did not publish as many things as he probably should have. However, he appears time and time again, and an anecdote which I've told many times, but I hope this audience will forgive me, is one day I was going up, I was being interviewed at Radio Oxford, when I was in the taxi, and the taxi driver said to me, "What are you going to be interviewed about?" I said, "Oh, a new book by Tolkien." And he said, "He's dead, isn't he?" And he's quite right. There's a lot of posthumous material coming out by J.R.R. Tolkien. So these are the types of things you may have seen: The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, Fall of Arthur, Beowulf, and so on. And I got to thinking about these things, and I tried to sort of group them. So in the centre, if you want to, you can go away and read The Monsters and the Critics, which are a selection of his lectures and essays. They're not all of them. There are a lot of his lectures still sitting in Bodleian, which have been unpublished and not worked on as much as perhaps they should have. And on the left, you could say, well, they're kind of scholarly text translations, which I would add the Anchor Wissa from 62 in. But on the right, there's an element of him having a go. And I'll come back to this about gap filling, etc. You could argue this, you could argue which way they fall, but Fall of Arthur, Cullervo, the Lay of Atruan, these are all areas where he's trying to have a go at. And by gap filling, I mean he's sort of imagining what else might have happened. So the text there about Finn and Hengist, an episode in Beowulf and then in the Finnsburg fragments, and he kind of steps away and he goes, what actually did happen here? And he has a go at writing it. So we'll come back to that again and again throughout the talk. You may recall I came up with the subgenres and high epic fantasy. Yes, without a doubt, Tolkien was writing what we loosely call high and epic fantasy. It is a tale, particularly The Lord of the Rings, of good v evil. It is on a scale that is extraordinary. It's the end of the Third Age, the culmination of the First and Second Age, you could probably say. It starts in northwest Middle-earth and goes down to kind of southeast Middle-earth to a degree. There's a world-threatening crisis. It's an existential threat to Middle-earth. Just ask yourself, what would have happened to everyone if Sauron had actually won? And it's also something which John Clute talks about in his Encyclopedia of Fantasy. It is about thinning. There is this element of transience, of past glories fading. And this comes up again and again, but the quote that always reminds me is Leaf is Lana, from Old English, life is on loan. But that passed away, so may this, from J.R.R. That idea that past glory, and sometimes past threats, can pass away. So there's my D. If you remember, my I was really about the setting, intrusive, liminal, or secondary world. And I think fairly easily we could say this is a secondary world, or immersion, as far as Mendelssohn has said. Middle-earth simply didn't happen. It doesn't exist. you can't find any of those places on a map of our known Earth, for certainly. So it is that secondary world that we go into and immerse ourselves. But is it? Now, you can take this picture with a pinch of salt. It's an artist's impression, and it always looks to me like a set of lungs. But basically what we are seeing here is an attempt to show Arda, Tolkien's Earth or planet. And that's the kind of area there, that's the Middle Earth where most of the action takes place in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And then on the left here we have the Undying Lands. And then in the middle what Beppe was referring to yesterday, this island, Numenor Island, which links to the Atlantis myth because it disappears beneath the waves. And I think the interesting thing here is that Tolkien repeatedly again and again says Middle Earth is our Earth. This is our Earth. But you look at that and you probably would be forgiven to say, well, it doesn't look anything like a map of the globe I've seen recently, and it clearly doesn't. But throughout his mythology, there are these seismic shifts in the continents which change everything. But most importantly, and this is, I think we'll come on to this later, is that these lands to the west at the end of one of his myth cycles disappears, not just disappears beneath the waves, but seems to go out onto another dimension. And what was originally a flat Earth becomes a rounded Earth. And the only way that you can find your way to these lands, as the elves do continuously in Lord of the Rings, is by taking the straight or the lost road, which is only allowed to certain individuals. And this allows him to start playing in with all kinds of things about these mythical lands to the west. Not the continent of America, but this out in this other sort of fairy dimension. And the time structures he gives up there are really, you will hear about first, second, third age and so on. He is talking about a grand scale here. But again, he talks about when we enter the fourth age, it takes us to the present day, to the day, the age of men, as in humans here, and that there will be this final battle at the end. So he plays fast and loose with this. He's not consistent, which you have to remember with Tolkien, he never is consistent. He constantly contradicts himself. But this idea that perhaps this was a prehistory of the world is something which we should bear in mind. And the letter I referenced there was his explanation, and again, we're gloriously fortunate to have it, of his entire mythology, which he wrote to the publisher, Milton Waldman, in 1951. And a text which I think has been mentioned, it was mentioned yesterday, is the Notion Club papers, which was originally The Lost Road, which he writes in 1945. Lost Road's a bit earlier, and it's that response to Lewis, I'll write something about space travel, you write something about time travel. And you can get it in the History of Middle-earth, Sauron Defeated. And basically the plot is there is this club, the Notion Club, Notion Inklings, get it? And someone ferreting around in the Bodleian in 2012 finds this manuscript of their notes, which is notes that they were having meetings in the 80s. Remember, he's writing this in 1945, of this club that meets and starts to sort of do the things that the Inklings did. But particularly what we start to get is a couple of the protagonists start to dream and have visions and then go on journeys where they start to realize that there's a continuity from their present time and their names going back through Anglo-Saxon times all the way to Numenor. And that's his time travel. So again, an attempt to knit his mythology together with everything that he had studied. Okay, setting. This is my Discworld again. Yes, of course, it's pseudo-medieval. There are Germanic influences, which we've discussed again and again. The trolls, the dwarves, the elves, the dragons. And I find it interesting what he said there. It's desirable if you can, necessary if you can, to use words that are already in existence, which have a certain sense and are laden with a certain sense. And therefore, I use dwarves and Middle-earth and elves and so on. You can't have everything absolutely strange at the outright. And I do think he kind of has something to say there. And I actually, personally, when I read or about to launch into a new series of fantasy writings, it's a bit of a struggle to get through that first chapter where you get all of those strange names and strange places, whereas he seizes on this. So he's doing it for various reasons, but he guides the idea that, well, look, these are already embedded in people's imagination, so I can reuse them. And I will come back to this piece of text again and again. I've written on this chapter here, so for those of you who've read my article, apologies, but this is from The Lord of the Rings, The Siege of Gondor, Return of the King, Book 5, Chapter 4, and you can see here, this is at the end of the Siege of Minas Tirith, the language, the range that's being used here, a huge ram, knights, shot and dart, siege towers, gate, etc., all the types of things we would associate with a medieval setting. I find myself saying this again and again, aren't I? But is it? Yeah. Is it really? Well, someone's already made mention of this, I think, in terms of the Shire. The Shire is we can pretty much date it to Victoria's Jubilee. It is that capturing of that Victorian idyll that Tolkien himself experienced as a child. And as many people pointed out, there are some archaic details in there which just do not make sense. They have clocks. So, well done the hobbits, and umbrellas. They've already managed that, whereas the rest of the Middle-earth is struggling. They have steam kettles and so on, and they have post offices. So they're kind of not in that pseudo-medieval world, is basically what you're trying to say. And then we move into something, the second red dot, Bree, for example, where we are moving back, a town with inns, etc. You're talking probably 14th century. Take Rohan, although he argued constantly, it is Anglo-Saxon England. So we're probably talking about 10th, 11th century at least. Then you get into Gondor. Well, he talks about Byzantine and Constantinople, etc. But sometime a bit after maybe late Middle Ages or sometime around that. And then we have the Buchel men and so on. It just shouldn't work when you think about it because it isn't consistent. So it is right to say you come away from it thinking this is a medieval setting, but actually it's very easy to find areas where it isn't. However, it was described as the last great work of the Middle Ages, The Lord of the Rings, but I would just like to say there's a lot of pushback against this in that Tolkien, I believe, is a very modern writer. There's this traditional view, he just didn't care, he rejected modern life, which is just simply not true. And he reads extensively of modern writers, etc. And we've already touched on the fact that he is engaged very heavily early on in environmental issues, which we then pick up later and later, industrialization and commercialization. And I'd just like to read, if I can, an extract from a poem. And this is Progress of Bimble, or Progress in Bimbletown, which he writes in 1928. And it's really a sort of his view of what's happening to the British seaside. And having spent a summer down in North Devon, I have a lot of sympathy for it. So he describes this place, Bimbletown. It's sort of a seaside resort or somewhere near the sea where people come and people come on holiday and on day trips. Sometimes through it, and this is rare, one can hear the shouts of boys. Sometimes late, when motorbikes are not passing with a screech, one hears faintly, if one likes, the sea still at it on the beach. At what? At churning orange rind, piling up banana skins, gnawing paper, trying to grind a broth of bottles, packets, tins, before a new day comes with more, before next morning charabangs stopping at the old inn door with reek and rumble, hoots and clangs, bring more folk to God knows where, to they don't mind, to Bimbletown, where the steep street that once was fair with many houses staggers down. It's a real view of sort of like that unrestricted sort of spread of people going out and just throwing their rubbish out at the sea and it's being washed up, and the destruction of things. And to me, that almost reads it. If that was in a collection of works by John Betjeman, I wouldn't be surprised. So to say that he isn't concerned with modern ideas, I think is just wrong. And I think also we've mentioned disenchantment. I think disillusionment is actually the term I use because it was a key concept that emerges after the First World War when people come back and this wasn't a land fit for heroes, and they found out all of the things that went wrong in the First World War. And I think he tackles that head on. He tackles exactly what's happening in the period between the wars, but also after the Second World War, when we were told in the 50s, no, all you should be reading are the kitchen sink dramas and the movement, he was saying, no, I think people still harken back to some ideas that were not powerless against some of the horrors that beset us. And we do have a desire to go back to some of our roots. So I do think he's a modern writer in that sense. Okay, characterization. This was D-I-S-C. We've got to disc. And I mentioned the dwarves in The Hobbit, as in they're not very good in terms of character profiles, but let's pass over because it's The Hobbit. And criticising The Hobbit is like kicking a puppy, so let's not do that. But a clear criticism of Tolkien is that, where are the female characters in The Hobbit? Well, there aren't any. Or in The Lord of the Rings. There are, of course, in The Lord of the Rings. And we can argue at length about that, about how well portrayed they are. But it's a sign of desperation when people say, well, there are. Look, there's Shelob. But, and maybe his understanding of Éowyn's sudden conversion to liking Faramir, just because she's looking over a wall, is perhaps not an exact study in attitude, let's put it that way. However, this criticism is excessive. And if you look in the Silmarillion, particularly if you look in the original drafts of the Silmarillion, and use Arda Reconstructed, a great book which shows you, he built some very strong female characters, and really they're very prominent in that book. So I don't think it's as fair, but you can understand why people did it just because of the published books. He got criticised a lot, and he still gets criticised. It's just good and evil. Everyone's good and everyone's bad, and that's it. And the good people win and the bad people lose. It's nowhere near as simple as that. And I think, as he observed, and I completely agree, people who say that clearly haven't read the book, particularly The Lord of the Rings. If we take, for example, the orcs, in Peter Jackson's films, they are what they are. They are just horrendous sort of cannon fodder. But as he said, we do get insights into the way the orcs think occasionally. And if you think of those sort of chapters where Sam and Frodo or Frodo's captured after the sting from Shelob, and Sam overhears the orcs talking, or when they are dressed as orcs and they're being marched around Mordor, you hear the orcs. And they're just like soldiers, basically. They're grumbling all the time. They're grumbling about their conditions. They're grumbling about their officers. They don't want to be there half the time. So you do kind of get that. Yeah, there's some less than pleasant characteristics about orcs, like cannibalism and so on, and that they tend to sort of just march through and slaughter. But I do believe if you study them, it is good. And actually, and Rings of Power, which let's put that to there. But I do think they're interesting. They're delving into the character of orcs, which is quite good. I mentioned doubling yesterday, and it's, that they're Faramir, how Faramir reacts compared to how Boromir reacts. How Aragorn is in terms of what he is trying to achieve as the Lost King, reclaiming his throne, compared with the Nazgul and how they behaved as kings or leaders. Sam and Frodo, and without a shadow of doubt, anyone who criticizes Tolkien's characterization, you just go back and go, well, what about Gollum? Where we get that psychological struggle in an individual. And actually, if you put Gollum alongside Sam and Frodo, you get that classic tripartite characterization, where all three make the whole. And for those of you, this is an example I often use. It may be a bit churlish, but if you think of McCoy, Spock, and Kirk, the three just complement each other in Star Trek, and that's how it kind of works. I'm not saying they're like that, but they're much better developed than those three. But think of that. So, okay, world building. Of course, Tolkien takes time to develop his mythology. I'll come back to the Voyage of Eärendil, the Evening Star, in a bit. But here we have, he's starting to work in 1915, 1916 on the Book of Lost Tales, which is where a mariner finds their way to the elven homelands, the elven isle, and they start to hear tales. So we have that framing structure, which we'll come back to again, and then he's working on it again and again all the way through The Lord of the Rings. And as I said, it posthumously comes out as the book that we now have called The Silmarillion, but there's a lot more to it than that. And the key thing you have to take from this is that if The Lord of the Rings doesn't reach print until 1954, He's been working on his mythology for 40 years. And we have to think about fantasy writers, and we're going to hear from some later, and there are some in the room, I know. Do you spend 20 years building your mythology without any thought to ever getting it published? And then put a tale on the top? Because that's exactly what Tolkien did, and Simon was exactly right. He never intended The Hobbit to get published. In fact, he never intended The Hobbit to be set in Middle-earth. It kind of got sucked into it before he knew it. And that's what's interesting about Tolkien. Why is he doing this? Well, he's doing it kind of for fun. But he lays the foundations for reasons we'll come on to, and then he adds over this, or overlays the stories. And the foundation was the invention of languages. The stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse. To me, a name comes first and the story follows. He was playing around with inventing languages as a child. He loved it. He's a philologist. He carries on, and he develops them, as you all know. But he realizes a language can't just exist without a living world to put them in, and that's what drives him to start writing his mythology. And world building, and I'm going to show a couple of examples here, is extraordinary, I think, in Tolkien. So on the right, you have a standard Proto-Indo-European family tree of languages, and some of us will be familiar with these things. Tolkien certainly was. It tries to show how the roots of language develop. And on the left, we have him playing around exactly that, tree of tongues, where he shows the relationship between the languages and so on. He's thinking at that level, which is absolutely extraordinary. If you don't think it is, let's carry on with that, shall we? So, attention to detail. The ghostly images behind are because copyrighted, of course, but I've taken some quotes where he's working out here the distance to the fords of Isen, 15 miles, to the gates of Isengard, 30 miles. How far can a hobbit or orcs move on foot compared with someone on a horseback? Right, okay, so he gets to some struggles. Well, if it's a full moon, which way will the shadows lie that I have to think about? Do I have to change the text as they're going up the steps of Cirith Ungol? And he starts doing that. He gets a cop-out, basically, so he takes, what's the moon cycle in 1944? I'll plonk that on my book, but it works. And I love this quote. At this point, I require to know how much later the moon gets up each night when nearing full, and how to stew a rabbit. And then he starts to work on structures, on January the 16th, the Company Ring, there's the Battle of the Bridge in Moria, Gandalf Falls, okay, Gollum's Dog and Company. And he has, you can see them if you look at, for example, the Voyage en Terre de Milieu, the collection from the exhibition in Paris, really detailed plans of his plots. It always reminds me a bit of I gather when they were doing Fawlty Towers, John Cleese and Connie Booth had a massive wall full of plot structures, and they mapped out exactly to the line of the script how it would all come together. So it's a bit like that. Again, attention to detail is extraordinary. Flora, fauna, geography, distances. And sometimes his mythology overtakes him, so that the tale about why The Hobbit in 1951 is important is because if you read the first version of The Hobbit in 1937, when the ring appears with Gollum and the riddles, etc., basically the story goes, Gollum, look, if you win, I'll give you this ring. And of course, then he writes The Lord of the Rings, and that's the last thing Gollum would do, is just hand over the ring. He doesn't hand over, Bilbo finds it. So then he has to rewrite The Hobbit in the light of how the mythology is changing, and he does that, and the revised version comes out in 1951. And that then puts him in a quandary, because you could go into a bookshop, and if you get the 1937 edition down, you're going to get a very different tale from the 1951 edition down. And Tolkien doesn't just leave it at that. Of course, he says, well, basically, the 1937 version is the one Bilbo tells the dwarves. But the 1951 version is the one we all know to be the truth, that he reveals later, and Frodo and Sam pick up. Attention to detail, it is extraordinary. Okay, so objective, why is he doing this? We've talked again and again about on-fairy stories. And, a bit like that letter from 1951, we are so fortunate that just at the point he's really engaging with The Lord of the Rings and his mind is shifting, he delivers this lecture, which then is published, which really is his treatises, his theories about fantasy literature. I would say don't just read that, go off and read Mythopoeia, his poem, which is a result of a walk with Lewis and Dyson in Magdalen College, and also the essay that came out in the 2005 edition of Smith and Wootton Major. You have to kind of read them in the round, but On Fairy Stories is so important. It was delivered in 1939 as a lecture and then published in 1947. And I think these points have already made. He's really setting out that fantasy or fairy stories are not just for children. Let's rescue them from the nursery, because they really portray or convey the key human faculty, and that is about subcreation, making secondary worlds. This is something which we aspire to do. And if you do this successfully, you will engender secondary belief in the reader. They will immerse themselves fully in the text. They will believe what they are reading, and they'll come out of it. And he talks a lot. He has some really interesting points here, which again have come up, I think, yesterday, about recovery. Because you're in this fantasy world, you then get a clear view of things we take for granted. You can see reality freshly. But it also allows you to escape, and escapism is a term that is thrown at fantasy incorrectly, I think. I don't think it is. But what he's saying here, it's escape because we can escape the confines of reality, of mimetic literature, if you want, like a prisoner escaping jail. And then there is consolation, which we'll come on to in a second. Okay, I'm just going to put this here because it's a theory which, I first came across it by the great scholar of Tolkien studies, Tom Shippey, and that is the asterisk reality, which is another thing that Tolkien's done, and I've hinted at it already. On the right, if you don't know, what you're looking here is, again, a philologist's playground, where we're looking at the words 11 and elf, both means 11, of course, and they go back, and then they get back to a point, and they go, yeah, we don't quite know what the word would have been in Proto-Germanic, but we'll come up with an idea. And that's probably what it looks like, and you'll see there's an asterisk there. So it's filling in the gap where we don't have it. And this is what starts Tolkien off. I said I'd mention this poem from 1914. At the top, you'll see the manuscript, the Old English poem, Christ One by Kinnerwolf, the imaginatively titled Christ One. Christ Two's better, and there is a Christ Two. Christ Three fades. But on there, you know, as we've read this and everyone's done it, Hail Earendel, brightest of angels sent to men over Middle-earth, a true radiance of the sun. And something sparks in his mind and he reads that and he goes, well, who is this Earendel? What is it? We don't quite know. We think it's possibly Venus or something like that. So, being Tolkien, even in 1914, he trots off and he writes The Voyage of Earendel, the Evening Star. And when he was asked by one of his friends, what's it about? He says, I don't know, I'll try to find out. And that actually, if you look at his composition of The Lord of the Rings, often things throw in and he goes, where did that come from? And then he tries to work it out. So it's a kind of example of asterisks where we've got what survives, but where did it come from? In his case there, Earendel becomes the mariner in his tales. And you'll see this again and again. In his Beowulf edition, we get the Selich spell. Beowulf is probably a bringing together of multiple tales, probably by a single author, but things were happening centuries before that they've picked up. So he doesn't just take that for granted. He goes out and tries to write one of the tales that maybe the poet behind Beowulf picked up. The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Beorhton's son. Battle of Maldon, a famous poem in Old English, but the battle in 991. Well, what happened after the battle? I know, I'll go and write a verse drama about it and just try and work out what it happens there. But in terms of his mythology, we have all of the things, the dwarves, elves, trolls. So what he's doing there is, look, if you read Old English, you read Middle English, as we've heard again and again, you come across these creatures. But why? Where did they come from? Where did the ideas come from? I know, I'll write a prehistory where there are dwarves, elves, and trolls, etc., and there's a Middle-earth. And I'll write one about Ents, Enter Yeweork, as we've already heard from the ruin, but also possibly linked to Macbeth, where he was a bit fed up that the trees really didn't go up Dunsinane Hill. And then there's the Lost Road, the Notion Club papers, this idea that there's a mythical land to the west. Well, King Sheev in Beowulf, there's this character at the beginning who is sent off, comes from somewhere and goes off somewhere. Well, that's what he's playing with in that, or the voyages of St. Brendan, those Peregrinus pro amore Dei who sailed off madly into the Atlantic Ocean from Ireland, but in the Tale of St. Brendan he finds a mystical isle. And even when you get to the Hobbit rhymes, you know, he starts writing his Man in the Moon poems early on. But, you know, they then become those nursery rhymes that we tell you, hey diddle the cat and the fiddle. Well, he writes the earlier poem that then led to the one we tell. And of course, then he thinks, that's a Hobbit rhyme. And it becomes in the Tales of Tom Bombadil and so on. So it's all about gap filling. Objective, I'll just go on about a few things which have already come up. He does say this is all about fall, mortality, and the machine. Fall, there's a lot of people who fall in Tolkien's mythology, Morgoth, Sauron, Feanor, Thorin. They all fall from grace in some way or other. And the book, as you know, is the downfall of the Lord of the Rings. Mortality is another key area which he plays a lot with. The problem of death, the escaping of death, and he even said that it's this idea of the escape from death or death is the key spring of... Now, everyone thinks he says the Lord of the Rings. I dispute that. I think he says the law of the ring. But anyway, he says that's what the books are all about, death and trying to evade it. And this is all obviously a very Catholic view, has already been mentioned. He was a devout Catholic and very active in the Catholic Church, and particularly in Oxford, what was happening here. And then the third area is the machine, that technology can corrupt nature or destroy nature or corrupt people. And I think all of these, again, are very modern views. They are things which we probably come up again and again with. My R was roots. Where does he fit in the long history? And this is actually a slide which has worked well, because what it does is pick up everything you've heard so far. So, do you remember yesterday? We talked about that hoovering up of myths and legends, possibly for nationalist purposes, by people to collect them together and then put them out. Well, one of the things he was slightly upset about was he didn't think England had its own mythology. So he plays again inconsistently with this, but he is perhaps toying with this idea that he could create a cycle of myths for England to my country. We also heard about fairy tales, folklore tales, but fairy tales. And one, I don't think he's been mentioned yet, but a strong influence on Tolkien as a child was the Andrew Lang coloured fairy tale books, which aren't just about fairy stories and fairy tales. There's a lot of some Old Norse legends and repurposing in there. What we heard last night, and we've heard a bit this morning, you know, he read Morris, Dunsany, Haggard, particularly the She novels as well. They all influence him. David Lindsay, I think, has been mentioned, a strong influence. Grace has just talked about E.R. Eddison. So all of these things are in this cauldron, and everything you've heard about, in a way, leads to this talk. One thing which he said, I fear you may be right that the search for the sources of Lord of the Rings is going to occupy academics for a generation or two. And I hold my hands up, I'm one of them. And a book that myself and a colleague did, Elizabeth Solopova, where we take the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and go on. And what we're trying to do there is go, look, there's an episode in these books. It really links, or has a lot of similarities, what you'll find in these Old and Middle English and Old Norse and Finnish texts. Okay, my L, I'm nearly there in terms of my Discworld. Magic in Middle-earth, just because we had it as part of Adam's definition. He says he was a bit casual with the word magic, and he didn't really use it correctly. Actually, when you look at it, he's quite sparing in his use of the term magic in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and so on, and sorcery, and so forth. And again, as Tolkien, he thinks very deeply about it. Magic has to be believable to keep up the secondary belief, but he understates it, I think. I think you get natural magic in there, you'll get the monsters, the creatures which are magical, but it is not the full-on J.K. Rowling school of magic. It is very underplayed. And of course, Tolkien, being the academic, then starts to think about magic and starts to think about its roots and some of the terminology and the philology that goes with it. And he starts to define, going back on some medieval and classical theories about magia and goetia, the physical magic or the spells and the conjuring. And he elaborates on this, so you can go away and read this letter. But magia could be, as was, held good, and goetia bad. Neither is in this tale good or bad, but only by motive or purpose or use. Both sides use both, but with different motives. And what I think it's important here to say is that it isn't the magic that's important, it's what you do with it. And that's what Tolkien is trying to convey in this tale of power struggle. Depth. I think depth, I've realised, is really world building, but let's just go with it. Depth allows him to achieve his goal of getting the inner consistency of reality, so that you as a reader believe in what you're doing. And there's various things he does here. So scholarly apparatus, so your maps at the book, there's introductory essays, there's appendices, there's the annals, and so on and so forth. A lovely example, I think, oops, sorry about the text that's just appeared on there, is the left is the Book of Mazabul, which he actually sits there and makes that, thinking it will go in the illustrated version of Lord of the Rings, but it didn't. And he uses his knowledge of what happens in medieval manuscripts like Beowulf on the right. So there are maps, so the map at the Hobbit at the beginning bases ourselves in it, and then we get the Lord of the Rings. References to the past, another classic. I don't know if he was the first, but he does it probably the best. Subsequent writers try to do this, such as J.R.R. Martin, not as well. But examples here from The Hobbit. Before you could get round to the south, you would get into the lands of the necromancer, and even you, Bilbo, won't need me to tell you the tales of that black sorcerer. And of course he never does, and we never find out in The Hobbit. But we know that there's something going on. And then Fellowship of the Ring, I do not think that tale should be told now, with the servants lending in their hand. And this is all an example of depth, because what happens is you get a glimpse that there is something much bigger going on behind this story. And of course there is, because he's worked on it for 20 and 30 years. And then he uses the framing devices, which has been mentioned. So the Book of Lost Tales I already talked about. But The Hobbit is, of course, The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, being the record of a year's journey made by Bilbo Baggins, compiled from his memoirs by J.R.R. Tolkien and published by George Allen and Unwin. And Lord of the Rings survives to us through the Red Book of Westmarch. And there's a potted history of that manuscript and how it survives from the Shire all the way to us. I mean, it's on the runes of The Hobbit, it's all nonsense, of course, but it's brilliant in a way, because it does give you that. You read it and you go, really? Really? Oh, is that how it happened? Oh yeah, the Book of Westmarch, it must be sitting in Bodleian or something like that. And Tolkien found it and he's translated it, not very well. That explains some of the inaccuracies in Lord of the Rings. But no, you go, no, of course, none of this happens. But it's a framing device, it's a way of doing depth. Okay, so that was my proposed framework. 1 minute to go. Okay, style. The thing which I felt it's missing, and I won't do this very quickly, is style. So perhaps we should call it disc worlds. And that piece of text from the end of Minas Tirith, the Siege of Minas Tirith, I think is important. And as I said, I've written on this quite extensively, but you can see so much going on in here, even if you just take it. Forget the rest of the Lord of the Rings, just read this extract. We get magic, we get that in there. Words of power and terror to rend heart and stone, as if stricken by some blasting spell, and we get magical creatures, so it is fantasy. We get characterization in there, we get Gandalf. Gandalf and Shadowfax, I think we forget Shadowfax, bless him, but he's in there. And the words that Tolkien uses with Gandalf and Shadowfax about unmoving, they're commanding, they're stoic, they're still. We get the Witch King. This is where the Witch King rides into Minas Tirith. And he uses an example of what we call variation in medieval literature. Look at the multiple descriptions of the Witch King, a horseman, the black captain, the huge shadow, the black rider, etc. He completely does that to layer on the effects of who this thing is. And also that this is a person who moves, who commands power, whereas Gandalf and Shadowfax just stand still. The Witch King keeps moving forward and nearer and nearer. We get characterization. if you forget Shadowfax, don't forget Gron, the battering ram. Gron, the battering ram, actually takes on a life of its own. It isn't just they shove a ram at the door. We get the name of Grond, we get its background, and Grond crawls on. He isn't pushed on. Grond starts to become a living creature. And then we get in what Tolkien often gets criticised as about his style. It is full of this piece, archaic style. The syntax is wrong. We get the verb at the end of clauses in sort of the way you would in German. And it reads old-fashioned, and the semantics, sorry, are not showing up there. It's full of a register associated with the epic. But he's a genius. It's just repetition. Look at the repetition. The drums rolled louder, the drums rolled and rattled. Thrice he cried, thrice. There's so much going on in this text. There's even alliteration, if you want to look for it. And he controls the pace. If that wasn't enough, 1 minute. He controls the pace fantastically. This is a masterpiece of prose narrative, because you get to that point where that green blob is and you pause and you think it's all over, but he's taking you through it by managing these short sentences and so on. There are even influences from the First World War, I would argue, in that. There are even influences from Christianity. Thrice he cried, a cock crowing at the end, probably about dawn breaking, but we all know the link there to St. Matthew's Bible. And then finally, eucatastrophe. Every time I read this, every time you may have read this, it wasn't one of his favourite scenes. That bit at the end, when the Rohirrim and when the cavalry actually come, brings a lump to your throat. And it was why it made me look back on this scene and just work out why he's doing so well. So, my time is up. I'm just going to say that not everyone likes Tolkien. He got a bit of a kicking when it came out and afterwards, and particularly around the time the polls came out in 2000, and The Lord of the Rings kept getting voted the best book of the 20th century, which really annoyed a lot of people. So that's another reason to applaud Tolkien, particularly the people he annoyed. And there's that extract, and I would just finish his own reflection on it. The Lord of the Rings is one of those things. If you like it, you do. If you don't, you boo. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stuart. We have time for a few questions. Anybody like to start us off? All right, I saw your hand first.
Thank you very much for this. It was a really rich and fascinating talk. Just a question about, you talked about subcreation very briefly, and we've had it mentioned several times in the past couple of days. And it's just, especially as you sort of touched on eucatastrophe there at the end and the relationship between these things. Yeah. It strikes me that there's kind of two forms of subcreation that we have running. One in our conversations, one is sort of creation as something underneath, and then one is sort of, I think this is what some of what you're saying is getting at. That for Tolkien, and from his Catholic perspective, there's a sense of storytelling as participation, not just something that's sort of like, there is this world that has been created and therefore we then create lesser things, but rather that what we create is building on and continuing a work which has already begun. I wonder if you could talk.
Yes, exactly. So I think you're absolutely right. And the key thing is why it's called subcreation, because creator is God. But it's one of the gifts of God, if you like, to humans, is that we have this ability to subcreate. So we're participating. By doing that, and that desire to do that, we're participating in God's work. And we can also, through it, engender, this is Tolkien's theory, what God was trying to tell us, and that's that eucatastrophe, that there will be a joyous turn, that good will win out in the end. Now, I don't mean that. That doesn't mean that you all have to go away and start writing mythical worlds, because you can be a sub-creator in your own mind, in my view, just by immersing yourself in someone else's world and imagining it. And that's where it moves into imagination, the fact that we can all think, we can all envisage. So we're sub-creators in that sense as well. And I think that's where he was pushing it. there's a lady there? Just there, Bond. Oh, right, okay.
This might be a bit of a silly question, but a lot of the Tolkien having a go, I suppose you could consider Tolkien writing fan fiction. And so how much would you say that working up that level of fan fiction sort of improved his craft in writing? Do you think it had a big influence in what actually he created thereafter?
I think that's not a silly question at all. That's a brilliant point. To think of Tolkien as the precursor of fan fiction, but he was a fan of medieval literature, so he's having a go. Yeah, I think it does develop his style. So, a lot of the verse you get in Lord of the Rings, he's imitating styles that he picks up from medieval literature. And there's one of the appendices in the collected poetry volumes. He lists all of the poetic styles, the meters, etc. he wants to have a go at. And all of the poets he really likes and words that he really liked, and he tries to weave them in, which we do find in his poetry. So I think, yes, it did. It probably, no doubt it did. Of course, he's playing around with all kinds of things, prose and poetry. So yeah, that's a great point. Well done. We have an online question? Right, okay.
Oh, okay. Hello. Okay. Our first question is from Ali Mirzabayati. Thank you, Dr. Lee. Regarding Tolkien's naming, especially since he even composed Old English versions of his texts, do you think his use of Old English and Old Norse was mainly to make his world feel less strange, or was it a part of a more ambitious attempt to build a tower with old stones and fit his literary oeuvre into the tradition of the old northern legends?
So I think the analogy in the second, so the point that's been made in the second is a reference to his essay on Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, where he uses the image of the tower, and the tower is the kind of the work, but all we've done is pull it all down and look at the stones, and we've forgotten the scale that you could of the tower itself and what you could see if you stand at the top of it. So I think there's a few things which probably are the way to answer this. First of all, he's drawing on what he knows about. He's drawing on what he enjoys. So he is very adept at doing the names and nomenclature from Old English, Old Norse, etc. That's possibly what inspires him in the Germanic tales. But of course, I already mentioned Finnish. We have Welsh influences on it, etc. So he draws on a lot of things. And I think, but he also has that point he made there that, by using some of these terms and words, they're not too distant from the audience he was originally intending this for, which was a UK audience. Let's start with that. I mean, it obviously has a global impact now. But when you come across those names, particularly if you start with the Shire names, well, they're all around this in Berkshire and Oxfordshire. But then you start to come across, say, some of those names in Rohirrim, the names of the characters there. And they kind of ring true to sort of British people, because when we were at school, we all did 1066 and all that comic book and so on. And we have those names at the back of our head, the Egg Kings and so on. So it begins to pick up, and it begins to feel a bit more familiar. So I think it's multiple angles to that.
Are there any more from the audience?
Yeah, just wondering whether you think that The Lord of the Rings is literature in the same way that Ulysses or In Search of Lost Time is literature, or whether we have to kind of almost create a new sort of category for what Tolkien is trying to do.
It's a good point. It landed at the wrong time, as I've already mentioned. The mid-50s is not the time when what people were expecting. And I've written on the radio dramatization, which came out a year later, and the listeners, well, what the hell's this? So, where's the allegory? And Tom Shippey, I think, says it succinctly catches it. He says the reason people don't like Lord of the Rings is because they don't understand it. They don't know what to make of it. So, yeah, it bucks the trend. I mean, I think it's literature in the sense that a text that emotionally moves me or would have done in the 50s, I think it will still do that in 100, 200 years. I think people will still be reading it. And it's important because it says a lot about the 20th century. So I think in that sense, yes, it definitely is. But you're right. I mean, it wasn't, as we've seen through all the talks yesterday, unique. But it was, Brian Atterbury calls it the end of apology. And I think that's absolutely right. It was that, well, by its appearing, we no longer had to apologise as adults for enjoying fantasy literature. And it sort of led to that. So I don't know if that quite answers your question. The succinct answer is yes, it is literature. And yes, it wasn't what people were expecting.
Hiya, thank you for the talk. I'd be interested in your perspective, having talked about kind of the asterisk theory and touching on earlier the comment on fan fiction, as to how much you think Tolkien and his contemporaries are the reason that fantasy, sci-fi is now seen as kind of answering the what-if questions, and is that from how they kind of filled in the blanks and the what if around the talking animals of Narnia, for example, how much of that came before and how much of it is because of Tolkien and Lewis?
That's a good question, because they are, I mean, you're right, particularly in Tolkien, he is playing around with the what if. What if there had been a world like this, like we're all familiar with in The Lord of the Rings? That would explain all the things that, that then subsequently happen and that we pick up, and Tom Bombadil and the Green Man and so on, and it, it answers it. So in that sense, it is the what if. And I mean, I suppose it's a bit like the answer there, because it allowed then people to move into that space and start to do that. Now, of course, in science fiction, they've been speculating in all kinds of ways, particularly in between the war periods, about dystopian, utopian worlds that you could go and find, and that was a way of exploring what we have in here. But they certainly unleashed it, I would think, in terms of a popular genre. But people have always been imagining what if. So I don't want to put Tolkien as the key one. You go back and even to sort of like Thomas More, Utopia. What if. Imagining things like that. So it's been going on for some time, and I suppose even the Epic of Gilgamesh is a what if, isn't it? What if we can try and find out how to have eternal life, which is the first one ever.
We want to have time for a quick comfort break. We might have to stop now, but if people are happy to go on, then we could have one more.
I think because we've got 2 more talks, we thought it would be good just to give everyone a chance for a few minutes stretch, and then we can reconvene at, say, just after 5 past. If that's okay? Thank you.
Hi, welcome back. We're, right. Well, we have Felix back to speak to you again. You've met Felix already, but medievalist, scholar, librarian, scholar of modern fantasy, and he's going to be following Stuart Lee's talk on Tolkien with a talk called After Tolkien. So please welcome Felix to the podium.
Thanks very much. I've called it After Tolkien, but it's in the program as Following Tolkien, but it's basically the same thing. I should probably subtitle it Standing on Mount Fuji, based on Stuart's quote. So instead of trying to sum up the impact of Tolkien on the entire genre of fantasy, I'm going to touch on just 3 writers, 2 of them British and 1 American, who began writing imaginative literature featuring wizards and quests for magical objects in the 1950s and 60s. How did they respond to what Tolkien was doing? Did they try to emulate him? And my main question is, what was Tolkien's immediate influence on younger writers at the time? So the first of these I want to talk about, I think this was I wasn't here for Caroline's talk earlier, but I think he was mentioned as part of the Oxford School. But he's hopefully a well-known figure at this point. A few years ago, he was the oldest writer to be shortlisted for the Booker Prize with his novel Treacle Walker. He was born to a working-class family in Cheshire, near to a village called Alderley Edge, which is important to his fiction. He was one of a generation who attended Oxford in the 1950s and was taught by and often met Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Very important to his books and the way that critics usually interpret his fiction is this working-class background and the fact that Garner, he came up through the grammar school system and won a place at Magdalen College, Oxford, and this kind of, to him at least, separated him from his family, culturally speaking. There is a story that Garner tells, I'm not sure if it's true or not, of him abseiling down the outside of Magdalen at night and his feet touching the top of C.S. Lewis's head as he's leaning out to smoke a pipe. Not sure if this is true, but it's a very useful visual metaphor for how Garner thought of people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and the kind of fantasy that they were writing. He didn't think much of it. He left Oxford in his second year after the realization that he needed to become a writer to kind of reconnect with his background. He returned to Alderley Edge and bought a very old house for not very much money and began to write The Weirdstone of Brisingamen, which was published in 1960. And quickly after that came a sequel, The Moon of Gomrath, in the centre there. And these two books, they're set in Alderley Edge on a hill called The Edge, and two children, Colin and Susan, become embroiled in this like magical battle between wizards and elves and dark elves and a Dark Lord figure. And then he wrote Elidor, which is a kind of secondary world fantasy almost, but with parallels to modern-day Manchester. And The Owl Service, which uses a story from the Mabinogion, the Welsh cycle of legends. So repetition is a key theme in Garner's writing. There's always a myth that's being cycled through, experienced over and over again. The impossible question is, were any of these direct responses to Tolkien's work, or was it just something in the air? Garner is on record as saying he did not read The Lord of the Rings until many years after Weirdstone was written. He has in several interviews renounced Tolkien. There's one interview where the interviewer asks, I imagine then that when The Weirdstone of Brisingamen appeared with its wizard and its army of dark elves, people who didn't know the legend of Alderley claimed that you'd copied The Lord of the Rings. And Alan says, which showed that they hadn't read any Middle or Old English. Tolkien and I ripped off the same sources. He did it for his reasons. I did it because, at a simple level, I hated made-up names. If I'd used a name that was familiar, considerable baggage would have come with it. And then he tells this story of when he gave his archive to the Bodleian, at some point, he heard from someone connected with the Lord of the Rings films that one of the Tolkien family had given him J.R.R. Tolkien's annotated copy of The Weirdstone of Brisingamen, and apparently his notes are just vitriolic. What bothered him, the interviewer asked. Trivial use of language. I would love to see that book. So whether or not that story is true, it points to a fundamental difference in Garner's approach to fantasy. He may have been using the same sources, Old Norse, Celtic, Old English, but at this stage it was his way of expressing the importance of myth and local landscape. The second author I want to talk about is Susan Cooper, again probably mentioned this morning. She was born just a year after Garner, and like him she was at Oxford during the 50s. She studied English at Somerville, where she became interested in journalism as a career. I never met Tolkien, she says, but I went to his lectures on Anglo-Saxon literature, along with hundreds of other students. He was a wonderful lecturer. Like C.S. Lewis, whose lectures I also attended, he was a tweedy, pipe-smoking, middle-aged man. We were all waiting for the third volume of The Lord of the Rings to come out. Her most famous work is The Dark is Rising sequence, which began in 1965 with Oversea Under Stone in the middle there, which is a kind of modern-day hunt for the Grail set in rural Cornwall. And the next book in the series, The Dark is Rising, is set in Cooper's home county of Buckinghamshire and expands the scope of the book to a mythic battle between light and dark. All 5 of the books, there are 3 of them there, draw heavily on English and Welsh folklore, Arthurian legend, and feature a recognisable Merlin character named Merriman Lion. Cooper remembers reading The Lord of the Rings with astonishment. She found that Tolkien's work was full of the same Anglo-Saxon and Norse literature she was studying at the time. But she has written about how, while she was bowled over by Tolkien's Middle-earth, as with Garner, the idea of creating a completely separate secondary world was never her intention. The modern material world is the effective setting for fantasy, she writes. An arbitrary time in a never-never land softens the punch. For example, if we're in El Dorado and we find a mandrake, then okay, so it's a mandrake. In El Dorado, anything goes, but by a force of imagination, compel the reader to believe that there is a mandrake in a garden in Mayfield Road, Ulverston, Lancashire. Then when you pull up that mandrake, it is really going to scream, and possibly the reader will too. So there is some real influence of Tolkien in these books, I think. But again, like Garner, there's a fundamental. She's drawn more to setting fantasy in the present day, low fantasy as opposed to high fantasy. And then lastly, Ursula Le Guin, Californian-born writer in 1929. She started writing fantasy fiction when she was 9 years old and did not come across The Lord of the Rings until she was 25. Obviously because it hadn't been published until she was 25. When The Lord of the Rings appeared in the library, she reveals in an essay, I shied away from it. I was afraid of it. It looks dull, I thought, like the Saturday Review. It's probably affected. It's probably allegorical. Once I went so far as to pick up volume 2, when it alone was on the rack, and look at the first page, The Two Towers. People were rushing around on a hill, looking for one another. The language looked a bit stilted. I put it back. The eye stared through me. The early fantasy that she was writing, the early fantasy she was reading were people like Lord Dunsany, or the pulp stories and astounding stories. But she was more interested in people like Charles Dickens and Tolstoy than the fantasists. When she eventually read Tolkien, she felt herself relieved that she hadn't read him earlier. By the time I read Tolkien, however, though I had not yet written anything of merit, I was old enough and had worked long and hard at my craft to be set in my ways, to know my own way. Just skip to the end quickly. So her most famous work is the Wizard of Earthsea series, set in Earthsea, which is a secondary world. She had Tolkien in her mind when she first created it. She was asking herself questions about wizards with grey beards who are ageless Gandalfs. How did they become these old grey-bearded mages? And so she invented a school for magic set on the island of Roke, where Ged, who's the main character, attends this school. But the Earthsea books lean less heavily on Western medieval tradition than Tolkien, and instead look to a range of non-European stories and mythologies. Whereas in Middle-earth, antagonists are usually dark-skinned and come from the east, in Earthsea, Ged's skin is described as copper-brown. Taoism is also very important to the kind of philosophical and magic system of the books, as is Jungian psychology. In conclusion, we tend to think of Tolkien as a monolith, and yes, he has directly inspired later series such as The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and Terry Brooks' Shannara series. But even at the beginning of this post-Tolkien era, there were writers who were reacting critically to his work or were more intent on pursuing their own ideas of what fantasy could be. Thank you.
Our next speaker is a living fantasy author. We're going to have Sarah Mughal Rana come speak to us. She's the author of a forthcoming epic fantasy trilogy called The Dawn of the Firebird, and she's the acclaimed author of the novel Hope Ablaze. And she's an MPhil candidate right here at Oxford, and she explores the intersection of policy and human rights, and her debut novel was selected as the Library Michal Threet's debut book club pick and earned a Junior Library Guild Gold Star standard. So please welcome Sarah to come talk to us about Jinn, Faith, and Oral Folklore, Decentering Fantasy Outside Christian Allegories.
Just, you guys can hear me? Okay, awesome. I think the greatest injustice in how we talk about stories today is that both we and our stories are constricted by the Western canon. And we're actually wrongfully assuming that the Western canon is the only way to tell a story through the archetypes of Judeo-Christian traditions. Even the way that we structure our plot is circumscribed. Think of the hero's journey when you're actually telling a story. It's a model that's treated as quite universal, when in reality, it's only one type of cultural imagination. So today, I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to imagine differently, because only then can we get richer stories. And in my talk today, I'll be using Northrop Frye's academic theory, where he assumes that all of literature, and now by extension fantasy literature, comes from biblical frameworks. And I'm going to challenge that. I remember sitting in class when I was listening to this theory, and I was quite baffled because I was like, this is not something that I subscribe myself to as a writer. And as I came to write my book, Dawn of the Firebird, I had to use a lot of the assumptions that I was told was the only way to tell a story, and I had to tell myself to resist that and tell it the way that I thought was right. And so in Northrop Frye's theory, he argues that the Bible provides the central mythological framework of Western literature. Fantasy authors like C.S. Lewis leaned into this by reshaping biblical typology into critical allegories. I reject that notion through two subpoints. Firstly, I say that lore and motifs do not have to exist in Frye's mythological structure. I again used a case study of my novel, Dawn of the Firebird, and critically, the rich world within my book draws on Islamic lore, cosmology, different types of angels, jinn, and demons, and I challenge a lot of the assumptions that exist for those types of mythological existence, because a lot of that is derived from biblical frameworks. Okay. As I said, Frye's theory in Anatomy of Criticism identifies recurring motifs as central to Western myth. So for Frye, the Christian allegory, especially the typologies, anchors in different types of motifs, such as comedy, romance, and even the tragic hero. These stories are seen as extensions of biblical forms. So a lot of times the Trinity is actually quite critical to these books. He also displaces biblical forms, even if different fantasy books exist and they say they draw on different types of mythos. He still argues that all of those books orbit the biblical framework. So he would argue that Lewis obviously re-represents the biblical myth in the fantasy genre, but he actually puts that argument even more, saying that any type of literature and story, even if it's fantasy, even if it's not, is an extension of the Bible. So obviously with C.S. Lewis, the Christ figure Aslan is Frye's archetype of death and resurrection. How do I challenge that? A couple key ways. Firstly, in Dawn of the Firebird, I develop motifs that disrupt Frye's system. Frye's explanation of biblical archetypes like the fall, resurrection, the Trinity, and a Christ figure he sees as universal. In Dawn, I split that complex spectrum as different moral possibilities by challenging the idea of a fall, resurrection plurality. So, as I said, Frye sees angels and demons as displaced archetypes of the Bible. A lot of times in stories, a classic story, you see light versus dark, you see good versus evil. In Islamic lore, in my book, I take a lot of the assumptions of these motifs and give it the lens of Islam. So angels exist within my book, but they're not the same angels like the devil that fell from heaven and was a fallen angel. Instead, in Islam, we see angels as flawless servants of God. So in my book, I put that idea and I show that angels are not the same type of fallen archetype that you see within biblical frameworks. Similarly, you have the idea of demons or dark forces. That exists within Dawn of the Firebird, but we have the idea of Jinn. Those are smokeless fire beings that have free will, they still have souls, but they embody morally goodness, morally badness, and ambiguity and temptation. So they're actually quite similar to humans. They could be devils, but they can also be good beings. There's 3 other motifs that I challenge. So Fry argues that death is another type of allegory within storytelling. Death is obviously seen as a destructive force. It's something the character must overcome. And when a character dies, that's the end of their journey. Well, within Dawn, I actually challenge that. For example, death is actually seen as a sacred tradition within my book. In the fantasy world, martyrdom is actually seen as the pinnacle of the hero's journey. So if you die as a hero or you die in martyrdom, it's seen as, accessing some type of higher, intellectual, soul, spiritual reality. It's also a way to access divine justice within my book. So morally good characters revere death because it's where heroes edge closer to the fulfillment of the hero cycle. Similarly, I draw on the story of Adam and Eve, a classic story within the Bible, and obviously Fry sees it through the biblical framework. Well, within Dawn of the Firebird, I challenge the story of Adam and Eve. I look at it through Islam's interpretation of that story within the Quran or other Abrahamic traditions. So within my book, I do take the story of Adam and Eve, but I actually draw on the classic symbol of death, which is the raven, because the raven taught Adam's son how to bury the first murder of mankind, and actually use raven as a cultural symbol to accept and revere death within my world. As I was saying, there are other types of archetypes that exist. Fry obviously assumes that canon and literature can only be told through written script. But I actually challenge that within Dawn of the Firebird, because for us to assume that literature and the canon can only exist in written script or be passed down through written script is a critical assumption, because that's not how most canon outside of the Western canon exists. So within my book, I actually celebrate oral storytelling. In my world, tradition and culture is passed down through oral storytelling. And so Fry's model kind of enforces this archetype. His second key motif is actually Noah's flood. He looks at the flood as this big kind of divine justice event. He also has other motifs like trees, gardens, even the idea of an apocalypse. It's seen as an imaginative power that supersedes and goes into other types of literature. So if you read other books, he actually sees every book representing those types of motifs. Within Dawn of the Firebird, Noah's flood also exists, but it exists again through Islam's interpretation of Noah's flood. Instead of a big, giant flood that was a source of divine punishment, in Dawn of the Firebird, Noah's flood is seen as a localized flood and a kind of cleansing. So this story that I wrote exists to tell a different account than the Bible's interpretation, and it challenges Fry's assumption that all stories must come from the biblical canon. So critically, what I want you to take away by this presentation is, what is the point of talking about stories that exist outside of biblical frameworks? Why am I challenging Fry's theory? Well, I want you to think about one of the most famous academics who was a Pan-African sociologist. Dubois talks about the idea of double consciousness, and I want you to take that into your writing if you're a writer, or even your reading. It's a sense of seeing oneself through the eyes of a dominant culture. Decentering is about claiming authority to imagine differently. For example, when I was working on Dawn of the Firebird, my lovely editor Vicky, who's in the audience, was the one who gave me permission, and I needed to hear it, to be able to imagine and challenge the cultures that I'm writing into my book. I didn't have to derive it from something that already exists in the real world. I had the permission to imagine differently and to draw on, yes, my own religion and other types of cultural traditions without being an exotic Oriental supplement. So if you're writing, especially if you're interested in cultures outside the biblical canon, then I actually implore you to do that, and I implore you to decenter a lot of that. Secondly, what's important is Western readers imagine myth only exists again in those biblical archetypes, but the critical harm of that is that you sideline thousands and thousands of other traditions that exist in the canon. So if my stories are being rejected because they go outside those frameworks, that's not fair to the stories that can otherwise exist. And it actually probably makes you a worse writer or a worse reader, because you're only limiting yourself to one construct. And so what I wanted to take away by this presentation is that you need to give yourself the permission to imagine differently, because only then can fantasy be a genre that blooms. Fantasy is beautiful because it's a veil to imagine and look at different moral spectrums, to look at different types of traditions, and even the way that they have different value systems. And only then will you be able to enjoy fantasy as a genre it is. Thank you.
Questions? We've got time?
There wasn't a plan.
I mean, if we have time for like one question.
Okay, so should we take a question from the audience? Yes, just down there. You can get the mic.
Hello, that was an incredible presentation, so thank you so much. I just want to say that first. I'm wondering about mythology that predates the biblical canon and kind of your perspective on how even the biblical canon itself almost draws upon that in a way, and how, I guess, seeing it as a three-part of before the biblical canon and after, sort of how the biblical canon itself has changed due to translations and kind of just the culture that has surrounded it, and how it has become from something that was so intertwined into Middle Eastern culture and all of that. Sorry, this is like so convoluted.
Yeah, no.
And how it has become like extremely Western in its culture, I guess.
Yeah. So I think you point out something that's important, which is obviously the Bible wasn't the first book or written script to exist. Obviously, there were other types of religious cultures, Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Jainism, Buddhism, and I actually studied a lot of different scriptures from Buddhism in particular when I was writing Dawn, because Dawn takes place after Noah's flood, and I couldn't just rely on the Bible or Islam. I had to try to look at different types of monotheistic cultures that existed before it. But you point to something which is important, which is that a lot of times people assume these stories only came and existed in the Bible. But obviously there are other scriptures that exist that have similar types of motifs, similar types of archetypes, or imagine the story of Noah's flood, Adam and Eve, differently. One example I'll give is if you look at Proto-China, for example, they actually worshipped a deity called Di. It was a monotheistic deity. And if you look at monotheistic cultures, they studied and have similar types of kind of monotheistic, I guess, a divine-like figure. And those have existed for like millennia. And so one way that we can try to stop the watering down of these stories, as you said, and stop them from being only seen as Western, is for you just to write. I wrote something in Noah's flood instead of something that takes place vaguely during Islamic period or in the Middle East, because I was like, I don't need to be constructed to the Middle East or South Asia. I'm allowed to write a story that takes place after Noah's flood. And so you can actually combat a lot of that watering down by giving yourself permission to write those stories that take place in Adam's time or in some made-up world that takes place in the very beginning of human existence. If you try to limit yourself and look at historical sources and be like, oh, I must only write like that, you're limiting yourself. And so I really, with the wonderful support of my team, was only able to do that because they accepted that story in its most original form.
Okay, that's time, I think. So I would just say thank you very much, Sarah, for a fantastic talk. You've really moved us on to the next stage now of the summer school. And thanks to all the speakers as well. Serve downstairs. We said yesterday, don't all rush. Take your time. It will be there for an hour.